Hi guys, we're going to give everyone another 30 seconds or so just to start joining, and then we'll be with you. Hi everyone, welcome to this month's webinar. We're going to do something slightly different today, and we're going to try a new bit of technology that we've got. Now, whether it works or not is another thing. So I've got some staff in the office in the background, and they're going to sort of let me know if things don't go technically to plan. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about how we're going to make 300% in the property market. Now, it's not one of these get rich quick schemes, nothing like that. This is a tried and tested method, and we're going to show you how it has been done in the past. Now, it is a lot of money, and it's not something that's an overnight success, but with careful planning and with the right attitude and the right mental foresight in terms of where you're actually going to be buying, I've got no doubt that we can replicate it. So look, without further ado, let's sort of turn to the board. So you should all be able to have a screen share. We'll turn to the board, and we'll start off with the first part of the presentation. So look, we all have had before times where we want or where we've thought about buying something, and we've thought about things, for example, like we've got Netflix, Apple, Amazon, Tesla. Now, I remember being, I just graduated from university, and I just started work. And one of the guys, one of the brokers on the floor told me at the time that Amazon had just broken into a profit. And again, I didn't think anything of it at the time. I thought, oh, it's just one of these companies that might be here one minute and gone the next. But look what it's come into. We're now talking about, multi-billion-dollar company. They're looking at doing huge amount of innovative things. For example, like they're looking at their own department stores. So the majority of people that we speak to wouldn't have bought Amazon back in the day, but of course now they are. So what we're saying to you is, you all know a product that's gone through the roof. And again, we've got Tesla on there and Bitcoin. Some of you might have even thought that you wanted to buy, or that you were going to buy something like these in terms of the stocks at the time. Now, a lot of people say, well, does the same thing happen in property? Well, the answer is yes. So what we then have to do is we then have to look at areas where this did actually happen. So for example, we've got areas, Hackney, Waltham Forest. Now, Hackney's a big one. Hackney's one that, for me, is one of the best areas to buy in. And I know Hackney very well. I'm 20 minutes from Hackney. I had friends who lived there. And back in the sort of, showing my age, but back in the mid-90s when we used to go and see our friends, I remember at the time, it was like one of those areas that you probably didn't want to frequent. And now the house prices have rocketed. So the last 20, 25 years, we've seen a huge amount of gains in Hackney. But the same is with Waltham Forest, Barking, Lewisham. But what we then have to do is we don't have to look at just those areas and that's it. We have to look at the whys. So what we have then done is we've then sort of meticulously gone through why those particular areas have done what it's actually done. Now, the beauty of the property market is the fact that when you invest in shares, if you have £50,000, for example, and you invest in shares, you will actually have £50,000 worth of shares. That's it. You're not leveraging, you're not borrowing any more money. But the beauty about the property market is you can actually leverage. So the reality is that if you buy £50,000 worth of shares and it doubles, you make £100,000. Or you pull out £100,000, I should say. But if you go in the property market and you invest £50,000, you can actually leverage. So if your property price over the period of 10 years actually doubles, well, you're actually doubling your money on the 200,000 property price rather than just the 50. So what the example that we've given here is, if you start off with a £50,000 investment and you borrow 150, and actually it trebles, well, you're pulling out £600,000 from a £50,000 investment. Now, of course, we know that you've got to pay back your mortgage, but your mortgage is 150. So you're actually still left with £450,000. Now, that's something that you can't do in the stock market unless you're a day trader or you qualify for certain positions like CFDs. But typically, in terms of the property market, an amateur investor, which the majority of us will fall into that category, can actually go and leverage up to 4 times their money. So that's the beauty of the property market. We then, of course, have to go and look in a bit more detail in terms of where this is going to happen next. How do I get that type of return? And then, of course, as I said, we have to look at the historical evidence. Now, we've analysed each of those areas. So we've analysed those areas that we discussed earlier, and they've got something in common. So first of all, they were all affordable at the time. Now, what I mean by that is we're not talking about areas that you can go and that you can personally afford. We're talking about the wider market. So it's not about what you can afford, it's the wider market. So you may have X amount of money and you might turn around and say, well, I've got 400,000 or 500,000, I can go and buy that. But that's not the average. So we have to look at the average property price, make sure that that's the affordable property price. And all of these areas were below market value in that regard. So they were all below the national average to start off with. And I think that's one of the keys. So what we did is we looked at the prices and we looked at the national averages at the time, and they were all below that average. So that's the first point that we have to look at. Secondly, they had transport links that were being dramatically improved. None of them were in an area where they had already made it. The best example of that recently is you have the new Elizabeth line, which was called Crossrail originally. And that particular line, if you had a house, and a lot of people didn't know at the time, but if you had a house in Ilford, Romford, Shenfield, those kind of areas, they were dramatically increased in price the moment that the Elizabeth line got announced, or Crossrail as it was called at the time. But all of these areas that we're looking at, and I would advise that you look at in terms of where to buy, they're all going to be areas actually which have got a great transportation potential coming up. Now, we know announcements. It's not as if they suddenly decide one day and the next day the transport's in. 4 or 5 years ahead of actually when that transport is in, you will actually have announcements. And if you go onto local governments and council websites, you will know what transportation is going in. There's transportation for Manchester that's being going into 2040. So we know what the plan is over the next decade or two. So the next thing that we need to look at is transportation. We then move on to schools as well. So people move to the area because when they have children, they think about the kids. And so schools is something else in terms of the area. So we want to look at schools where they have a good couple of schools at the moment, but maybe some plans for schools or some private schools, public schools, and some great state schools with some good Ofsted ratings as well. What we noticed about a lot of these areas is that once people started to move there, it's a bit like the chicken and the egg scenario, but once people started to move there and then suddenly the bars and the affluency came to that area, we noticed sort of schools were next in line. So as I say, we look at below national average, we then look at the transportation side of things, and then we can start to head and we start to look at the schools that are coming up. And again, neighbouring areas, this is key as well. What we noticed is that the areas that we took, the neighbouring areas to the top, bottom, left and right, they were all areas who had similar growth over the past 5 years. So if we took Hackney and we headed a bit further into London, the neighbouring development or the neighbouring area, and we're not talking about 20 minutes down the road, we're talking about, it could be sort of 5-10 minute walk. They had the growth already. So it was key to see that if the neighbouring areas had the growth, then it was fantastic. And we started to see that it was actually everything around the area was increasing. Now, as we then sort of move on, what we start to then see is a younger demographic. What we saw with Hackney is that the area was very much a council area, and then suddenly a younger demographic liked the vibe of Hackney, and they started to move in. That then pushed the prices up as people started to buy and rent them out. So as a younger demographic started to get attracted to the area, then we started to see, as I said, the coffee shops, the restaurants, the boutique bars, the shops, things like that was being attracted to the area. So the whole area went up in value. And we've seen that here again. We've seen it in London, we've seen it in Shoreditch, and as I say, Hackney is a prime example of this. Now, in terms of what and why people don't actually achieve this, because when you actually, let's go back to the stock market. When people look at the stock market, the reality is the stock market that's going to have the big boom over the next sort of 10, 15 years is probably a minnow now. So it's something that you probably won't know about. And it's the same with the property market. People look at the here and now. The majority of people, when they're buying through their own eyes. So they're looking and they're thinking, well, actually, would I live there? Is that something that I would live in? The reality is these areas, these up and coming areas, you probably wouldn't have lived there at the time. So the majority of people that purchased there were people that bought and literally rode on the crest of a wave. But the reality is you have to stop looking at it through your eyes and if you would live there. You have to think logically, and actually, does this make a great investment? Another reason that people don't invest in these particular areas is because when they're thinking about their retirement or their pension, they're not thinking long-term enough. So the reality is when you think about retirement, people don't invest in their pension as much as they should, because they can't see the benefit. If you're thinking about, if you're 30 years old and you're thinking, well, actually, my pension, my retirement age is going to be 60, 65. The reality is you're not thinking about what your life's going to be like when you're 60, 65. But someone once told me that actually, imagine someone from the past coming to the future and giving your present self X amount of money. If someone did, if your past self come and give you 100, 200,000 pounds, well, then the reality is you'd be extremely grateful. And that's all you're doing. Whatever you do now financially, whatever you're putting in place now is going to have dramatic effect further down the line. So what we're saying to you is think 10, 20 years in advance, because that's what you're doing now. You're investing now for 10, 20 years in the time. And another thing as well, as I mentioned to you, you look for your own perspective. You've got to think outside of that and think that actually it's not me living there. As long as it rents now, as long as you've got good income now, the growth in these areas will then take care of itself. Now, importantly, what we're then looking at is we're then going to start to see about the areas that we would actually recommend. Now, there are a number of areas that are going to do this, and the areas that we've recommended, it isn't confined to these particular areas, but we've got 4 key areas where we feel is going to be really beneficial. Now, when I say about the areas, we know Manchester has been fantastic. We know Manchester's been great over the last decade or so plus, but there's certain pockets in Manchester that still haven't had the fantastic growth and the potential that it can do. So we know Manchester, from a transportation perspective, it's got HS2. We know that that's going to happen in the next decade. Again, people have bought on the back of that, but the reality is more and more people, as that HS2 gets closer, sort of 2032, 2033, it's meant to be completed by. As it gets a little bit closer, we will start to see more and more people buy, more and more people pay attention to Manchester. That's the first thing. So we know that HS2 is there. We also know that the Metrolink, now this map that you can see here is a planned Metrolink up to 2040. So we know the reality is that people that are buying now are going to have this expanded map moving forward. Again, this is 18, 19 years ahead of schedule. So we know the areas that are going through that. So we know that the transportation in this area of Noma and New Cross is going to be there. So that's the key. So we then head on to the next stage of this, and we'll start to see these particular areas side by side. Now, what you can see here is on the right-hand side in the red, this is Ancoats. This is an area that's already been through that kind of regeneration. Now, there was a famous comic who once said that he was brought up in the roughest area of Manchester, Ancoats, and it couldn't be further from the truth now. You're talking about one of the best areas in Manchester to buy. All of the warehouses have been turned into phenomenal residential stock, and people want to live there. As I say, you've got boutique bars, shops, bakeries, artisan bakeries. So all of that is really playing into the hands of the investor and the growth side of it. But as we look to the left-hand side, what you can basically see is that area hasn't had the same kind of attention that Ancoats has had. Now, Ancoats, as I say, is the area next door that's had the attention, dramatically increased the price. But you're talking 5 minutes away, and you've got this area in green where it's just started. You can see a couple of developments there which are just starting to and a few more that have completed. But we know this area really well. We've done a couple of developments in here that have completed. They've got some new hotels that have started springing up, and we know that hoteliers aren't going to randomly invest in areas. They're going to go to the areas where they feel that there's going to be a different demographic. So this is the area in Manchester that we feel is going to be the next place to invest. Now, this is, as I say, called Noma and New Cross. It's going through a huge regeneration, and the amount of residential planning permits that have gone through there is going to be phenomenal over the next decade. So this is why we say we can get in now, and we do have projects in now which are 30, 40,000 below where they should be in terms of the neighbouring areas. We know that this is a fantastic area to invest in. So as I say, so it has the potential, it has the neighbouring side. So definitely we would wholeheartedly recommend that particular area, whether it's through us or whether it's through other agents, or whether you can just simply find something on Rightmove there. We would definitely be recommending that area there. Now, we then delve into Liverpool. There are pockets of areas of Liverpool again, which have already made it. You've got certain, Liverpool's a different postcode. A lot of people say, oh, I want L1. It doesn't work exactly like that in Liverpool. It's not as if L1 starts in the middle, then L2 and L3 expands out. L3, for example, runs right the way down to the docks. Now, the particular area that we recommend is going to be Liverpool Waters. Liverpool Waters is a bit like what Media City was back sort of 10 years ago, and potentially even Canary Wharf back sort of 30, 40 years ago. Liverpool Waters is the old docks, which is kind of derelict. It's not had any TLC for X amount of years, but they're now going through dramatic change. And the Liverpool Waters scheme, as you can see from the photo on the bottom, the Liverpool Water scheme is dramatically set to change from the before and after. Now, whether they do all the skyscrapers like they would do is another thing, but the reality is that they're looking at spending a huge amount of money, over £5 billion on this area alone. Everton football stadium's going in there. Again, we're seeing hoteliers start to go in there as well on buy-up land. And this is when we know things are going to really start to kick off. And again, like Manchester, we've got the HS2 side going in. And again, as long as you've got rail times that are dramatically decreasing from 2.25 or 2.5 hours down to maybe an hour and a half, heading into Liverpool or even less, you're going to start to see a big influx, and it suddenly becomes commutable to other areas of the UK. So without a doubt, I would say that this area in Liverpool is one to look at, because you will start to see the schools head in there, the bars, the coffee shops, the hoteliers are already started buying up land and already started to put deposits down. So this is kind of another area that we see dramatic change. We then sort of head back, and there's a couple of areas where you might not look and you might not have thought before, because Liverpool and Manchester are always in the news. In a recent Zoopla report, Liverpool was up over 9% growth year on year, and Manchester was 7.2% year on year. But another area actually is Ashford, because Ashford's one that's not had the same kind of impact in the southeast as other such areas. But Ashford again has got great commuter belt. It's a great commuter district, because you're actually only half an hour from London. And I'm surprised, as I put here, I'm surprised people haven't picked up on this. There's a number of advantages for Ashford. First of all, is the distance that it is into London. That's the first thing. And secondly, you've got Ashford International. You've got this phenomenal train station, which gets you into Europe within literally 50 minutes. I think Paris is an hour and a half away, give or take. And then you can head down to the south of France from there. And again, you can get across Europe. So from Ashford International, everything's possible. So what I would say to people is, look, have a look at Ashford. You're talking prices to 240,000, depending on what you're looking at in terms of the sizes and how many bedrooms. But it's a great, great city, or town, I should say, for people who are looking at a commuter bound into London, and potentially you can do short-term lets here, letting to people heading over to the continent as well. Also, as we put here, you've got a £250 million film studio being developed. Then there's talk of that being shared with Netflix and Amazon. Now, again, key, we're looking at new workers, you're looking at a different demographic. You will be looking at a younger media type professional. They're going to want to rent, and that's going to put pressure on the housing, and they're going to demand something a little bit more classy in terms of not only what they buy, but in the area, they're going to want things like the bars, the shops, the bakeries, and so on. So what I would say to you is Ashford should be definitely one on your list, that over the next decade, we should see some great growth potential there. Now, as we sort of head out, the final one that we've looked at is Birmingham. Now, again, Birmingham has been there. It's not something which is new to you guys. You're going to know that Birmingham's a great potential city, but it's the area where to buy. Now, we've been actually advising Digbeth over the last 4 or 5 years, and it's just not been as prominent on people's radars as the Manchester and the Liverpools. It's just not been as pretty enough as one client put it. But the reality is that it does a fantastic job. Digbeth was actually rated as one of the best places to live in the UK. Again, you've got high-speed rail. It's going to cut the rail time down. It's not going to be as dramatic difference as it is in Manchester and Liverpool, because it only takes just over an hour to get to Birmingham anyway. But if they can start to cut that down to 40 minutes, 35, 40 minutes, you're going to start to see Birmingham to London becomes commutable as well. So Digbeth is a great area to buy in. The key to Digbeth is the price that you pay. There are some projects in Digbeth which are overinflated. Because it's caught onto this bit of a wave, then what they do is the developers will go and put another 10, 15% on. The key is paying the right price at the start. You don't want to have 15% of your profit taken away because you've just handed it to a developer. So Digbeth's a great area. Again, it's already probably further ahead than those other little niche areas that we spoke about. But the reality is it's all about the price that you pay in Digbeth. And there's a couple of really good options. And over the next 5 to 7 years, I feel it'll be a bit quicker than the other areas, but over the next 5 to 7 years, we should see some really great income generating and some fantastic growth potentials there. So all in all, we've got 4 fantastic areas where I feel that all you guys can make some great gains. As I say, that's not the exhaustive list. There's plenty of other options. But the key to me is all about mindset. I have so many clients say, well, you know what, I probably won't buy that because I wouldn't personally live there. Or do you know what, potentially I wouldn't buy it there because there's not much in the area. But that's exactly what you want to do. If you're thinking about stocks and shares, and you think about the stock market and you think, actually, where are you going to be buying and what are you going to be doing? Well, the reality is that you want to be buying a stock that hasn't made it yet. So you want to buy something that's potentially rough around the edges and maybe doesn't have the right or the perfect finances yet, because when it gets there, it goes up on the back of that. Now, guys, you should all have some questions or a potential to ask questions. So if you want to, I've seen we've got some already, so I'm going to have to look down here, guys. But if you want to ask any questions, feel free. So we've got one already. Noma New Cross. We've got something Noma New Cross, the regeneration in my hometown. We've got one guy who just said, yeah, it's just killed the town. But yeah, look, that's unfortunately the people that live there. That sometimes is the price that you pay. That's the brutal reality. Sometimes if you're there and it's a quiet town, it's a quiet area, you probably don't want the hustle and bustle of what's coming. But the reality is that's what happens with progress. That's what happens with change. And of course, the house prices will go up. So if you can put up with what you've got to do and deal with it for the moment, you will start to see some a dramatic change in terms of the pricing. Let's have a look. If it was me, what area would I purchase in? Yeah, good question. I personally am more longer term, depends on age, I think, as well, but I'm looking 20 years time rather than just 5 years time. So for me, every investment I get is a sit and hold area. So I would look at areas like the Noma New Cross, because I think that's a longer term plan. We're not going to suddenly see in the next 3 years everything shoot up in the area. So I'd probably look at the Noma New Cross area. Ashford, for me, Liverpool, although Liverpool's a great area, there's so much being done there that I feel you've got to get the right choice in Liverpool. And again, the problem with Liverpool is we have to just make sure that we get the right developer and the right options in Liverpool. So for me, I probably, if I had one choice and it had to be, I'd probably go for the Noma New Cross area, personally. Are there any properties without ESW1 to buy because the remedial work has to be done? Yeah, so that's basically someone asking there about the EWS1 form, the external wall safety form. So yeah, there's plenty of options to buy where we've got options where they have the EWS1 already. We physically cannot sell you something and push you to exchange and completion without that EWS1, because the reality is that you're not going to get a mortgage without it. Now, the legislation's meant to be changing. The government have come out and said, well, anything below 18 metres. There are some good options. For example, we've had a couple of options where there's a very small part of the build has needed a bit of remedial work and get the cladding off and new cladding put back on, and then it will get its EWS1. Now that's fine. What I personally wouldn't be buying is I wouldn't be buying something where you've got a huge amount of cladding and it's all over the building, because you're talking millions of pounds there. And the reality is developers aren't going to foot the bill. They might say they will, but most medium-sized developers will walk away. They'll put the company into liquidation, and what they'll probably do is it'll be left to you as the owner to pay through your service charge. So I certainly won't be recommending that. But if you've got something where there's only a small part of remedial works being done, then look, there may be deals to be had with those kind of projects. We had one. It's taken far longer than expected, to be brutally honest with you. But the reality is yes, everything that we advise on, especially new builds that are completing now, everything will actually have an EWS1. It has to get a sign off, otherwise it won't be signed off. Let's have a look. Which area is best for short-term lets? Again, good question. So out of those particular areas, I would say that Liverpool is phenomenal for short-term lets. It's a great leisure industry. Again, because of that, it suffered in COVID times. It really struggled, but simply because people weren't doing short-term lets. So the city really quietened down for that. But now we're getting the things back up. We're starting to see arenas fill up again, hopefully stadiums maybe next summer. then short-term lets should be back on the bill, especially at the start of next year. I think we have to get through this winter in terms of COVID. They're talking about fire breaks and lockdowns and things like that. But again, I don't know whether that's sort of scaremongering to get people to conform, or whether it's actually that's what they're going to do. I think it would be a real struggle to put another lockdown on now. But I would say that, let's talk non-COVID times. I would say Liverpool is probably one of your best bets for short-term lets, especially on the docks. And again, but Manchester, the New Cross area, we know the area. When myself, the brokers, and Jack, we go up there, you're looking at £200, £250 a night in some of the hotels. And we're not talking about, amazingly luxurious hotels, but they're just pretty chunky for their pricing in that area. And we feel that if you've got a great apartment in the area, you can let out for pretty similar too. So I would sort of probably be looking at those two areas for me for the short-term lets. Do I expect interest rates to increase? Right, okay, how do we answer this? Okay, should they increase? Yes. The reality is, with inflation, to curb inflation, that's one of the tools that they can use. So should they increase? Probably yes. It's probably sooner rather than later. Will they increase? Well, this is probably a little bit more political, because the reality is that they've printed so much money over the last couple of years, well, over the last 10 years, but let's focus on the last 2 years. So much money since COVID that if they did start to hike interest rates, it could be a mess. And we're not just, forget about the housing market for the moment, across the board, there is so much debt out there from individuals to companies to countries, that what actually would happen if they increase them too quick, I think it could be an absolute nightmare. So the reality is, I don't think they will. I think they're caught between a rock and a hard place at the moment. They've got inflation on one hand, where they need to do something about it, and they've got a huge amount of debt the other hand. So literally interest rates, probably doing that way, isn't the answer. I think they will start, again, we're still getting hugely discounted mortgage rates at the moment. They're phenomenal. I mean, a client of mine got well below 2% fixed for 5 years earlier this week. And I'm thinking, that is just unbelievably cheap money. But I do feel over the next 5 years, we are going to start to see steady interest rate rises. There has to be, because if inflation spirals out of control, then that could be worse than the actual debt problem. Got one here. Why don't you market terraced apartments or townhouses preferred by families that stay longer? Good question. Your focus is typically on apartments preferred by young professionals who don't stay too long. Again, yep. Which are leasehold. Yeah, so the main reason being is, look, we've got a number of properties under let, and you're right, families do stay longer in the houses in comparison to investors, young professionals, I should say, who probably 1 year, 2 years max. But the reality is if you take the best returning investments, forget about the last year and a half, it's been skewed by COVID. Take the last decade. What areas increased the most after the 2008, 2009 crash? Well, London as a city centre, it annihilated everything around it in terms of growth. So we always truly believe that a city centre price will always outdo suburbia. And that's, as I say, you can't take it over the last 2 years because suburbia has outdone the city centres. But the reality is that city centres will always beat it, because people predominantly that want to rent in the city centres. There's more population due to work in city centres, and there's actually not much room to keep building. So that's one of the main reasons. In terms of the rentals, you're right. If you get a good long-term tenant in a family home, you're laughing, we can't get around that. You can have a tenant that remains there 5, 6, 7 years plus. However, the reality is most people that want to rent a home are young families. People that want to live in city centres, young professionals. Once you start to settle down and you have families, you're going to start to think about moving into a home. So you've got two choices. You either buy the home, or if you can't afford the home, you rent. So what you then sometimes can attract is if you've got a property, and in Liverpool or Manchester, you can get terraced houses for 100, 120,000. If you've got a client or a tenant who cannot afford that particular property, 100 and 120,000, you've got to ask yourself, what is their affordability? And what kind of client is going to be in that? So we've seen a lot of problems before where their affordability is low, hence why they can't buy it. So they rent instead. And the reality is it then gets to a point where they actually can't afford to pay their rent. because typically rents are more than mortgages. So if they can't afford the mortgage, they're going to struggle with the rent. So you will have a number of points where you can say, I've got a great tenant in my house. But the reality is on average, we tend to find city centre apartments are easier to let. Yes, you have a higher turnover, but they're a lot speedier, but they pay on time. But when we have, and we can see this by the actual vetting that we do, when we ask for references, and we do it for the properties that we let in terms of a family home, we would say you're probably talking about 60% failure rate, whereas we have probably a 5% failure rate for references in city centres. So that just shows the kind of clientele. That's typically why we don't, because it's a lot more hassle if you get a bad tenant. Do we have any properties in any of your 4 areas without an EWS1? And if there's only a small amount of work to be done and they're habitable, will I be able to bring them to rent immediately? Yes, good question. So yes, there's options where we have stuff where there's a small amount of remedial work to be done. Again, the advantage of that is you get a commitment from the developer that they're going to do it. You get that in writing, and you also get a commitment in terms of the price. But you can rent it immediately. You can rent it immediately. They're not non-rentable properties. Just by not having an EWS1, it doesn't make it non-rentable. You can rent these particular properties. It just means that the work has to be done, and sometimes that will spill over into your service charge. Now, what you might want to consider is that if you're a cash buyer, no problem, but you might not be able to get a mortgage. I certainly wouldn't be advising buying high towers with cladding on it. That's a big no-no. But if you're looking for something below 18 metres, although the government have released the advice on that, it's got to go through RICS first. That's the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. If it goes through that side of things, then again, we should start to see lenders open up to being lending on these particular projects, which are below 18 metres. But yeah, we do. And again, our details are on your screen. So feel free to get in contact with any of the brokers or me directly, and I can walk you through a few options. Would you recommend someone renting a regeneration area when there's similar priced properties in better areas? Well, yeah, you're right. Typically, the rent for the first 1 or 2 years may be 10% less than what you're going to get in the city centre, like no doubt about it. But the reality is that if you go and buy in the city centre, you're going to be paying a premium of maybe 30 or 40%. So, for example, there were 2 properties recently. Just outside of the city centre, you're looking at 2 beds about 240. If you move that same property within the city centre, you'd be looking at maybe 330, 340, so another 100,000. The rents might not be too dissimilar, but from your perspective, from an investor's perspective, well, you're going to get nowhere near the same percentage yield because you paid 100,000 extra for the price, and you're going to get the same kind of rent. So yes, I understand what you're saying, but actually, you're sometimes better to get a cheaper property. In terms of city centre properties, you might get less rent, but actually your percentage is sometimes a bit more. The crypto market. The crypto market cycles every 4 years, and we're almost at the peak, according to the experts, and the property market cycles every 4 to 5 years. But where are we within the property cycle? Is it about to peak? Look, you can't say that the property market cycles every 4 to 5 years. It doesn't work like that. The reality is we had a crash in the late 80s, early 90s, interest rate issues. Then we had a crash in, the next crash was sort of 2008. So you're actually looking 20 years. That was the cycle of that particular house price boom. It was 20 years. It wasn't a 4 to 5 year cycle. How long do I think this cycle will last? I'm going to say probably pretty similar. 2008 to 9 was the crash. We're now, we've gone past the first decade, which has seen unprecedented growth. And I would probably say maybe mid to late 2020s, it's the interest rates that will kick it in. That, to me, when the interest rates start to rise, that's when we'll see a slowdown. And if they really push on due to inflation, again, for me, that's when we're going to have potential issues. But I don't see that being anytime soon. Well, look, guys, it looks like we've answered all the questions. So, again, thanks for bearing with us. I hope this worked. I'm going to play back the recording. So, yeah, if it didn't work, I'll let you know. And yeah, if there's anything else, that you want from my side, please let me know. But all of our details are here. I don't think you can see that. Probably it's moving up. All of our details are here. This is our number. This is my direct email. So it's been a pleasure, guys. And yeah, I look forward to speaking to you soon. Take care.